good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to those of you joining us today for this Q&A with the patrons of the Open Table Network. We've been here already together this morning, having a bit of the chat, and we're looking forward to speaking with you, asking some questions, and then hopefully you'll have some time to put some of your own questions too. My name is Alex. I am a former co-chair of the network and I'm currently the newest patron. I'm a theologian and minister in the URC, currently serving voluntarily as the assistant clerk to its General Assembly. And I'm about to begin a new role as the Campaigns and Church Engagement Officer of the Joint Public Issues team, which works on social justice and politics with 4 denominations. So that's enough on me. Let's focus on the Open Table Network, which is a network of communities which centre LGBTQIA plus people in a diverse range of churches around the UK. And welcome to my fellow patrons. So it'd be good for those who are joining us to get to know us all a little bit, really. So could each of you please say a little bit about who you are, how your connection with the Open Table Network came about, and maybe a little bit about where you are denominationally on LGBTQIA plus rights. And I'll remind you, if that's a bit long, I'll remind you of some of that as we go.
My name's John Bell. I come from Scotland. I'm a minister in the Church of Scotland, and until a couple of years ago, I was employed by the Highland community, in which context I've worked in the areas of music and worship and social justice. Where my denomination is in terms of sexuality and gender is a bit of a puzzle. We know what ministers can do and can't do, but we really haven't had much of a discussion about how the church ministers to, accepts, affirms people who are within the queer community.
I'm John Bradbury. I'm a United Reformed Church minister. And at the moment, I serve as the General Secretary of the denomination. In the context of the United Reformed Church, we had long and complex discussions around issues of human sexuality for many years, but they came to a head probably about 15 years ago. And that brought us to a place where local congregations may decide that they will conduct same-sex marriages. Before that, the decision was about whether they might bless civil partnerships. Obviously, same-sex marriage then came along. So local congregations may make that decision. There's no bar to ministry in the United Reformed Church to people in same-sex relationships. But that doesn't mean to say that all of our congregations would necessarily wish to be open and affirming in that kind of way. We hold together some creative tension in the life of the United Reformed Church, but by and large, I think we hold that together quite well. And one of the things which I think that models really well is that you don't have to have an out-and-out culture war on these issues. It is possible to live together with some sense of diversity. But I think after all our discussions, we had a slight tendency to say, just sort of breathe a sigh of relief and say, thank goodness that's all over. And that means we haven't terribly actively talked about these things subsequently. And maybe it's time that we began to again, but in a more constructive way, perhaps. We'll see.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Cherry Vann. I'm the Bishop of Monmouth in the Anglican province of Wales. And I've been Bishop for 5 years now. Having come from Manchester, where I was for about 30 years. Manchester had, at that time, an open table, and I spoke at that a couple of times. I was also part of the consultation that took place in Derby when they were setting up their open table as well. And I was really pleased when I went to Wales that I was invited to be a patron of Open Table. In terms of where the Church in Wales is, it's affirming of LGBTQIA plus people. It allows its clergy to bless same-sex civil partnerships and civil marriages, and we're just embarking on a consultation now with a view to seeing whether we're at the right stage where we can progress to same-sex marriage, sacramental marriage.
Thank you. So we'll talk a bit more about denominations in a little bit. We're going to switch focus to Open Table for a little while. We as patrons had the opportunity to watch some videos earlier talking about kind of what our Open Table communities are up to, and you'll have different experiences of local Open Tables too. So I wonder what excites you about what Open Table's up to at the moment.
I think for me, they seem to be modelling what I would hope all churches are, in the sense that they look to be intergenerational, multi-generational, which is what we saw in some of the videos. There's a genuine welcome and openness to everybody being affirmed and having a place to belong. And they're offering something, I think, that whilst many churches would want to be there, are not there in the same way. And I think for me, one of the really exciting things is that they are a community and not just a gathering for worship. So there is something around offering a space to belong, a place to share, a place to be, and a place to create that sense of community that's really very powerful in the Bible about being the body of Christ.
Can I follow up on that a bit? Because you mentioned intergenerational, and I wonder if anyone wants to share anything about, like, why do we feel that Open Table communities, like, that we are hearing these young voices in a way that maybe they're not being heard elsewhere?
Well, I think it's sometimes not an easy space in church life to speak into, whether to find your voice. And I was involved in the early days of life, the Open Table in Cambridge, that Alex more recently has been involved with. And there, in the context of both the way the community forms and some really practical stuff like, you welcome people with a cup of tea or coffee when they first get there, and there is a chance to engage before you go into worship, but also space in worship itself for people to engage and reflect and find a voice. I think that creates a space which lends itself to being more intergenerational, a space maybe where young people find that they can genuinely interact rather than passively receiving, as sometimes I think worship can be experienced as. So I think there is something about the kind of intentionality of the way Open Table has chosen to operate that creates that kind of space, which is really healthy and quite exciting.
I think that for younger people, the possibility of relating to anyone across the age span is really much more limited now than it was 40 or 50 years ago. Many people who are my age or a bit younger than me would grow up in families which were intergenerational, in neighbourhoods where you knew everybody. You went into an apprenticeship and you were in the world of older people, male or female. And now many young people are really kind of in a cocoon, separated from the rest of the world from the age of 5 until 22 or 23, when they've been through college and university. And then they become partners in the big living project, where those who are older than them are not necessarily those who are their superiors. So I think that the church ideally should be the place where people are intergenerational. But one of the things which I'm very impressed with regard to Open Table is that it does what in many churches doesn't happen, and it's not intentional, it's by default, that we talk about ourselves as being a church community, the congregation. And for most people, the experience is that they go on a Sunday, they may have tea or coffee afterwards, in which they'll just chat about the things which are significant for the moment, and then they go away. And the number of times, a number of places where people can share in a conversation which is open, whether it's about sexuality or whether it's about any other issue, where they try to find a relationship between the truth of the scripture and the purpose of God and the lives of that they live and other people live. That kind of open conversation in which voices are heard unjudgmentally is so rare that it's one of the places in which Open Table really shines, and it's a great model for the whole church.
Absolutely. So you kind of mentioned that modelling to the whole church. And one of the questions I've got here, which I think is something that some of our members have asked, is how can we as open table communities relate more effectively to the wider church?
I expect there's various ways that can happen, and at various levels. So there's that local level, actually, in the place where an open table meets. Does that worshipping community engage with maybe the worshipping communities that also meet in that building, who may potentially be hosting that community and so on. One of the things we did in Cambridge was for LGBT History Month, we would always have a joint service, which became one of the largest services on a Sunday morning of any in the year, actually, as the two communities came together to form one. So there's that local bit. But there is also, many members of open table communities will be members of other church communities or other congregations. That's a place where they can make those kinds of connections, to get involved where possible in the life of the wider church, in your diocese or your synod or your district or so on, and take the opportunity to engage with the wider church life, because that's how you can be leaven and begin to transform and offer something into the wider body of the church, as well as at times that more sort of being a kind of organised voice for people who often struggle to find their voice when engaging with church leaders or so on. So I think there's all sorts of different levels and ways in which people can take that open table experience and help it to be some of the leaven in the wider life of the church.
I think that something people could do for an open table is to encourage the churches to which they once or they still belong to have a meeting, and it's entitled 10 Things You Never Knew About Homosexuals. Because I think that for many people in churches, homosexuals and the whole gender debate has been problematic. And what people haven't seen is that real people who are involved in this is part of their life. And I think we have to have forums which are not Sunday morning, and it's not something that a prepared speech has been made about, but where people just share together their experience of being gay and other people share their apprehensions. And that is the kind of forum in which understanding can grow, rather than producing papers or having a speaker come to the women's group and tell them about lesbians and a third person kind of situation. I just want to encourage conversation.
This is something that I've been part of, actually. It hasn't happened very often, but on the sidelines of Pride one year, in part of my diocese, we had a space where people could come and ask us questions. I was there, and the parish priest, who is also civilly partnered, was there. And we just held an open forum, and there were a lot of people who came who were LGBTQIA+, but there were others who weren't. And it was a really interesting conversation, quite a vibrant conversation. And we were asked questions about our journey, our experience of the church and of being gay. And it was really quite liberating, actually, to have that group of people who were genuinely interested, just having that space to explore.
No, absolutely. I'm going to share a bit on that and then ask you a bit of a follow-up, because we've been talking earlier about, the assumptions that are made within churches and how people outside of churches experience them. And as someone who's been working in ministry of people largely outside of established churches over the past few years, one of the things that I've found is that people who I meet, particularly LGBTQIA+ people who are interested in talking about social justice, activists, for example, as soon as you're having a conversation that's starting from the perspective of the church being affirming, you can actually have a really positive conversation, and they're really interested about what the church thinks about things and wanting to actually have that dialogue. And I think you started to speak about an experience that sounds a bit like that. I wonder if you've got anything to say about yeah, I guess how have you been received outside of the church as a member of clergy who's able to speak openly and affirmingly about this stuff, and if either of you two want to join in on that one as well. Great.
Well, my most recent experience is in schools where I've been invited to go and talk about my journey. I think probably because I'm a woman and people haven't seen many women bishops as yet. And just to go and share part of my story and to include that part of who I am in the conversation. And last time I did that after an assembly, I was thanked by the head teacher for actually being able to say something about my sexuality and my journey and how I'd learned to not be ashamed of it, but to actually accept who I am and to be proud of that, and to recognise, to know that God kind of not only accepted me but loved me for who I am. And she said to me afterwards, the head teacher, you know, thank you for that. We've got some people in our year sixes who are clearly exploring their sexuality, and to hear what you said will have been really helpful for them. So any opportunities I think that we can take to talk about our journey, our faith in relation to our sexuality, which some people still struggle with, I think is an opportunity to be grasped.
There's an interesting congregation in Manchester Diocese. It's in Didsbury, it's called St James and Emmanuel. And this is a congregation in which there was a girl who was lesbian and who at the age of 13 took her own life because she believed, according to the understanding of the church, that God didn't like her the way she was. Now, if you go to that congregation now, it's completely transformed. And it's partly because the vicar of the parish decided that in the wake of the death of this beloved girl, the congregation had to talk about how it accepted or affirmed or denied the existence of gay people among it. And the result was that last year, it was the 10th anniversary of her death, and they hosted a conference called Radical Love, at which people from across the evangelical spectrum of the church, as well as the liberal spectrum, were able to come and listen to a complete day of seminars, a Friday night gathering and a Saturday seminars, in which people explored all the issues to do with gender and sexuality, and in which there were Bible studies where evangelical biblical scholars began to radically look again at the texts that have been used to kind of clobber people. Now, the result is that there must have been about 150 people at that. It was a public thing, but many people came from particularly evangelical churches just to find out how this church had transformed, and to be hosted by the congregation who have turned a somersault since the death of this girl. I remember going there maybe 12 years ago, and I was there last year, an entirely different minded congregation, and for the first time, the presence of people there who clearly neurodiversity and people of colour. And this would not have happened had the church decided we have to do something with this, and we'll share it with other people. Mm-hmm. And that could happen in any area, and particularly from a congregation up rather than from the diocese down.
Mm-hmm. I think there's also something about the way in which, often as LGBTQIA plus folk, we're part of multiple communities, and that can be increasingly unusual in church life, because we all know so many people get so sucked into church life it almost becomes the whole of life. And one of the things I find oddly, perhaps, is that outside of church life, people are much more up for conversations about the meaning of life, spirituality. Was Jesus who he said he was? How does one read the Bible or not? What's it all about? There are many people in church life are comfortable having those conversations. So I think there is almost at moments a sense that some of us are in a bit of a privileged position because we live in multiple communities simultaneously, and find that there's an openness for some of those conversations beyond the walls of the church that sometimes feel much harder than the life of the church. So I think there's almost a moment of privilege sometimes as well.
Absolutely, and kind of coming back to that culture war thing, that you mentioned earlier. It's definitely been my experience that when we have conversations with people in the different walks of our lives, that they can kind of actually those conversations can kind of move beyond that culture war dynamic. And when we're just speaking as two individuals across the table, that's what really changes minds. A lot of our members really want to be part of influencing change in their local churches and denominations. So any kind of last tips about what we can do where we think change is needed to be able to influence that change?
I suppose it picks up a little bit of what I was saying earlier, but there is a sense in which the first thing you can do to change something is to turn up. And that sounds a little bit daft, but turn up, put yourself out there, volunteer. If they're looking for someone to sit on a committee, say yes. Might not be the most exciting thing in the world, but suddenly you have a seat at the table. You have a space in which your voice can be heard, and perhaps sometimes we're not very good at putting ourselves forward and putting our head above the parapet, but turn up, claim a space, volunteer, offer, step out there, and because that's where you will find yourself in the spaces where the meaningful conversations can happen.
Absolutely.
I think it's important to find allies. It's very hard to be a lone voice. It's very hard to be the only one trying to move the agenda along. Find people who are supportive and who can be allies and who you can work with, either within your particular church or in the wider community that you either work in or live in. If it is possible for you and your church preferably to turn up to Pride event, that is also very powerful. Having been on one myself and having had people come up and say, thank you for being here. It's really good to see the church involved in this. It's really good to see churches claiming and inviting people to come and be part of their communities. Obviously, people are in different places and some will feel able to do more than others, but I think it's really important to find friends and allies who you can form a support group with and work together. So it's not just you on your own trying to do this stuff.
Absolutely.
I think there's two other things. The one is that I think it's important that people who are within this great community of different order people should not be single issue. That if all we want to talk about is transgender, or all we want to talk about is accepting people who are gay, or all we want to talk about is this, that, and the next thing. Life is a bit more than our sexuality or our gender, and I think that we have to make that quite clear by being interested in other things and interested in other people's enthusiasms. And I believe that when we do that, we can then challenge people who are not part of the LGBTQIA plus community to be people who will speak on behalf of those who are. Now, I take this because I remember years ago when women's ordination was being discussed, and you have this group of men saying, well, once a woman convinces us, and I remember thinking, no, the point is not a woman should convince us. The point is that a man should convince us, particularly those men who are stubborn enough to believe this is not a possibility. I think that that in this issue, to enable people who maybe the parents of a child who's gay or lesbian or whatever, to be able to speak about their pride in their child, or just to challenge people who have got no political interest in this, but who want to side with people who are in the queer community, that they should be able to make public profession of their affection for and their acceptance for us. Because if you leave it up to people who are queer, then we always be marginalised. If those who are not queer speak with affection for those who are, then there's a better chance of other people thinking, we'll be afraid of.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's kind of, we're in that position, aren't we, where we need, as LGBTQIA plus people, we need the world to get to a point where allies are able to actually answer some of these questions too, and it's not always us defending our own identities. I know for me as a trans person working in theology, wanting to get to a point where I can actually write about who and what is God. Like, that's interesting to me. Not is it okay to be trans? I think we could be moving past some of those basic questions. We've had a few questions come in online, which we're going to talk a little bit about. So one of them is from Diana Johnson, and Diana has said, as someone who ministers in the wide church, modelling my identity as not different but included, I wonder, when will we not need an open table?
That's a really complicated question, actually, isn't it? Because you can say, ideally, we want to live in a world where that everybody is created, honoured and respected by God, and upheld is just taken for granted, and therefore we do not need communities like Open Table. On the other hand, you know, as a gay man who is part of a statistical minority, there is something profoundly affirming about a space where I can meet other people like me, I can meet other people who've got similar stories and journeys to me. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I've had a difficult experience in the church. In fact, I've been extremely fortunate all my life in the church. I've been in places where I have been accepted. My sexuality, by and large, has not been an issue. So I'm not seeking to run away from something that's been negative, but there's still places I need in my life where it can be a gay space, as it were. So it's genuinely complicated, because on the one hand, of course, we shouldn't need this for all sorts of negative reasons of running away from a church which makes life difficult for us. But on the other hand, there's a really positive reason for the existence of communities like Open Table that I hope wouldn't go away.
I think it's a bit like asking, when are we no longer going to need the Mother's Union? When are we no longer having to need Alcoholics Anonymous groups? I think as long as there are people who feel marginalised or cut off, then a network of support is an important thing. And thank God the day will come when people are so open-minded and integrated and affirming that there will be no, I don't know if there'll ever be no need for this, because every generation has to deal with its hang-ups and its aspirations with regard to difference. So I think it's just part of the given. And the church has always had temporary experience dealing with a group of people. It could be black people in the white church in America or in South Africa, who for the moment, this is an important thing. And they don't determine when it will finish. They'll know it's finished when there's an integration.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't think I have anything to add.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. I agree with a lot of what's been said, and I think for me as a trans person, there's certain things that I can't say in other church spaces simply because I don't know that everyone will understand what I'm saying. And being in a space where actually there are some people who have shared experiences and can have conversations about them is really, really powerful. We've had another question around opening up new Open Table communities. I mean, we've been involved to different degrees in that, but does anyone have any advice about setting up a new community?
I think it's important that it's from the ground up, not top down. I think that it's about people identifying a need, or wanting to meet a need, or wanting to create a space, both for themselves and for the people that they know who need that space. I think if it's top down, then it doesn't work, because it has to be owned locally. And I think, as we were talking a little bit this morning, it's probably going to be best if it's not led by clergy, because clergy come and go. I think locally is really important where you start.
Absolutely.
I think it's interesting about the sales pitches. You know, Is it going to be, are you oppressed, marginalised, hated by people who know your sexual identity? Or is the encouragement going to be, it's a great thing to be a Christian and to be gay, and we're going to start a group to enable that to be celebrated. Because it's not just dealing with a problem, it's actually releasing a potential. You know, if sexuality is a potential, it shouldn't be always spoken about as if it's a problem.
I think, having been involved in the community in Cambridge in the early days, one of the things which surprised me, although it should have done because it's so blim and obvious, but I think we're very used to the thought somehow or other that church is just there and we expect people to come to it. And actually, we had very involved in that community who were brilliant at what the rest of the world would call advertising. And knowing how you get your message out there, knowing how you communicate, the effective use of social media, and actually, you know, part of what I think enables the community to thrive is when it finds in its local context the appropriate mediums to communicate their existence in. Because I suspect sometimes we do the classic churchy thing: you put a poster up in front of the church and expect that everyone will flock in. And yet that's not really quite how the world works now. So really think quite intentionally about your communication.
Absolutely. So I've got a question about how hopeful you are. So it says, given the current ambivalent situations in the C of E and kind of negativity in some more conservative churches, how hopeful do you feel about change in the wider church?
I think you have to be hopeful. I don't see any reason not to be hopeful. That doesn't mean to say it's easy, or that we haven't got a long way to go. But I think the trajectory is going in the right direction. You know, I talked a little bit this morning about the real differences between the Church of England and the Church in Wales. The Church of England, if you're in it, is not always an easy place to be. And yet, you know, locally, people can be really very affirming, even when the institution isn't. And I think it's for all of us to just keep plugging away and moving in the right direction, because we will get there. You know, the world has changed a lot since I was a child, since I was in my 20s, and it continues to change. And I have no reason not to be hopeful, but there are people still being hurt and will be hurt for a long time, I think.
Well, part of the history of the Christian church and its Jewish background is that people have always resisted change. And yet, change is a proof of life. If there's inert matter, nothing happens, then there's death there. And change is a sign of life. One of the passages in the Bible which I love, very rarely mentioned, is that the children of Israel make towards the promised land, and then they get to the gates of the promised land, and then they send out spies, and the spies go in, and they come back and say, well, I mean, some will say, well, we'll never do it. The people there are giants, just swallow us up. And two people say, well, actually, I think we'll manage it. But the prevailing mentality is we want to go back to Egypt. Now, what happens then is that God says to Moses, who's had a hard time with the people on the one hand, and God on the other, and the future ahead. And Moses says to God, I'm not sure what you're going to do. I don't know if you'll let us be taken forward. I don't think you're going to send us back to Egypt. And God says, no, you're going to go into the wilderness for 40 years until all the complainers die off. And I think that is a very interesting a biblical precedent which has to be put in the face of those who are stubbornly resistant. That God sends into the desert those who do not wish to move forward into a better place.
I mean, I think in terms of, you know, mainstream denominations in the UK, I am ultimately reasonably optimistic. But but I'm also going to sound a pessimistic note. And that is, I get more and more concerned about the kind of international culture wars that are going on around us. I look at the way in which Putin in Russia and the Russian Orthodox Church have aligned around this massively conservative agenda, which is very, very anti-gay, very anti-trans. One can see something of that movement around Trump and a certain form of conservative evangelicalism in the US. There are very, very well-funded organizations who, flood social media with messages that draw people into forms of populist nationalism that often is beginning to hitch its wagon to the name of Christianity. I would say a completely false Christianity. And whilst, as you say, locally in many communities, many parishes, many congregations, I think there is this inexorable move to being much more affirming. That's taking place in a geopolitical situation, which I find frankly quite scary. And I think that particularly the way trans people at the moment are being pilloried in the middle of this kind of global culture war, again, quite scary. So I am wary, and I think there's a massive call to what I would understand to be the Orthodox Christian Church, the mainstream church which focuses its life on discipleship of Christ, to stand up and critique very clearly those perversions of our faith which are seeking to do such harm at them.
So we've been kind of, I guess, wondering how much to talk about culture war, and because you brought it up, I'm going to ask a related question, which I guess is kind of my question, but also framing some other questions that we've had. Is there anything, and you don't all have to answer at all, but is there anything that you'd feel that you'd like to say about the culture wars around trans folks at the moment, given that there's a breadth of opinion in the LGBTQIA plus community, and there are trans folks in that community and in our open table communities? And just say no.
Yeah, I was quite, when you were speaking before about yourself, I thought, if you were to go into a congregation and to speak about being transgendered, there's two things people have to deal with. The one is the issue about which they might know nothing at all, and the second is yourself. And I would imagine that for many people, ignorance is what rules. And so, do we just, if somebody who's trans, who's quite a nice person, who might persuade us it's okay, or do we actually have conversations about what exactly does this mean? And what's the history of the prevalence of this happening within the, I've reading a book just now, it's been going on for years and years and years, way back into the 8th century. So I think that for some people, they will be moved because they have an emotional response to someone who is either queer or who's trans. And other people who think more intellectually have to be given information which puts things in a context and allows them to ask questions which should be answered with their prejudice.
Absolutely, and we've spoken before about kind of the way that silence breeds fear, and not being able to ask and answer questions is difficult, isn't it? What there's.
And I think it's fascinating the way this has become much more of an issue than it maybe was 10 years ago, when we were not having debates about which of the particular letters one ought to have in the LGBT whatever row. And there is a sense in which I think there's a culture of fear, perhaps, behind some of this, that you withdraw into the bit that feels more safe, and if the LGBT bit feels safer, then maybe you will withdraw into that. But I think it's, it's totally the wrong way up. Our starting point has surely got to be that each and every person is made in the image of God, beloved by God, called to a life of human flourishing in relationship with Christ. That would be our foundational starting point. And anything which determines that you're going to treat people differently by a particular category that you've imposed upon them is, needs to be anathema, really. So I suppose partly in saying that I'm quite wary of identity politics, because I think identity politics sometimes gets turned around and inverted, and I think that's maybe partly what we're seeing going on culturally at the moment. So I suppose ultimately, our call is to stand with anybody who is suffering the consequences of injustice, whoever they are, and that's not just within our community, but it's got to be within society as a whole, within life and the world as a whole, and that, to me, makes it very hard to see why we've ended up with this bizarre debate going on about the lives of trans people.
But I'm simply interested that if you were to have a meeting in a religious context to discuss this issue, you might get quite a lot of people there who will want to bludgeon or who want to condone or who want to encourage. If you were to have a meeting about how Christians deal with their wealth, nobody would go. So there is a kind of phenomenon whereby there's a minority group who will be pummeled by those who are the majority. But if you wish to deal with the majority issue, then we'd rather not deal with that issue. Thank you very much.
I think John's right. I think, we start with people are made in the image of God. Everybody's made in the image of God and is a child of God. I think there's a lot of ignorance around trans issues, as there is still around LGBT issues. I remember somebody talking to me in terms of, a chosen lifestyle, as though, I'd chosen to be gay, and I was, it's just extraordinary, the level of ignorance that was being displayed. I think there's a huge educational programme that we need to do, and we need to stand in solidarity with all our sisters and brothers and siblings, and just, go back to the basics. And the judgmental, the fact that, as human beings, I guess, we're so quick to judge, aren't we, and make assumptions about things, rather than actually getting to know people for who they are, and learning to live with difference and finding difference as being enriching rather than diminishing.
Absolutely. So it sounds like we could have another panel on difference and how we talk about identity, and another panel on economic justice. Would be really fascinating, but maybe that's for another space, but I would really love to do that. So we've had a couple more questions. One of them is, what would you say to someone who's in a church that's not inclusive? Should they stay or should they go?
Nobody should feel forced to stay in a place where they don't feel safe. That would be my absolute starting point. That's maybe a different thing to feeling uncomfortable. And my experience over the years of folk in that situation is that some will find that they do want to stay there because that is their community, and they're not willing to give up the stake they have in that community. But perhaps being part of other communities, maybe like an open table community, is what enables you to stick it out in that community, which might be quite uncomfortable. But for other people, I think, for their own well-being, and potentially their own safety, they might just need to get out. But that's something, that's an individual piece of discernment, as it were, about the context. Nobody should feel they have to stay to make a point, but equally, people should feel free to be able to stay if they think that's where they're meant to be.
Absolutely.
I think there's something about being in a place where you can be honest, or whether you feel you have to be dishonest. I mean, one of the things that I realised since being in Wales, having spent all of my life previously in England, was that there was a level of dishonesty about how I was living in England, because I wasn't out. I wasn't pretending to be something that I wasn't, but I wasn't being fully honest about who I was. And that ate away at me inside. It was diminishing for me as a person. And it wasn't until I got out of that situation that I realised just how compromised I'd allowed myself to be. And at the time, I didn't think I could do anything else. You know, it was just how it was. I'd learned how to be gay and in the church. And, you know, it was second nature. But, you know, I was living a compromised and less than fully honest life. And I think that damaged me.
Yeah, I'd go along with that. I think I would ask whether it's, what's it doing to your soul? Because if you feel that your faith is being diminished or affected because this issue just stares you in the face all the time, there's no need to stay there. But I think, you know, leaving a faith community and leaving friendships where is not a light thing to do. And I'm thinking in a completely different direction. We had a church in Glasgow which split on the whole gay issue. And so about 2/3 of the congregation left and set up their own congregation. I think we had 12 splits in the denomination, of whom I think only 2 are still existing. But I sometimes think, you know, if you were the grandson or the granddaughter of one of those who broke away, and you said once to your grandparent, why did we leave that other church? And they said, well, it's because of people who are gay. They probably don't understand you because they live in a different universe than that.
We've got a question here about the fact that it can be really quite difficult as an LGBTQIA plus person to actually know what a church thinks and to know where you can find a church that is inclusive and affirming. And someone's asked what can be done to encourage churches to be more upfront and honest about this. And I'm going to give a half answer and then see if anyone else wants to add to it, which is that the student Christian movement has started a brilliant campaign called Honest Church, where they're asking churches to simply state their view honestly, and they're trying to create a way in which that can be done that is non-judgmental. It's actually about, but where are you? And to encourage folks to state views. But it's complicated, isn't it? Because churches often don't feel able to do that. I wonder what you folks think.
It's very often more about where the minister is rather than where the congregation is. I imagine we said this when we were on the path towards the ordination of women. Churches identified themselves pro or anti ordained women, but actually if you asked every member of those congregations, you'd get a variety of views, and it would be the same on issues of sexuality, I think. So my worry for churches who either say they're inclusive or what is that actually there may well be people in those congregations who aren't at all. The vicar, the minister, the pastor, or whoever heads the whole thing up might be in, but it won't represent all views of the congregation. So I think it's a really difficult thing to ask unless the whole congregation is being taken on a journey towards inclusivity or open welcome. I think it's really hard to judge.
Yes, I mean, I think I would want to encourage churches to be as straightforward as they can about where they stand on these issues. But for some of the reasons we've just heard, it's not ever kind of cut and dried. So I know congregations in the United Reformed Church where I'm very, very confident They are as affirming, as inclusive as you are likely to ever find in a mainstream church. Can I guarantee that you will not one Sunday morning get sat next to someone who's a bit tricky? Well, no, of course I can't guarantee that. And equally, I know conservative congregations in the URC who wouldn't have a minister in a same-sex relationship, who wouldn't offer same-sex marriage, but who would offer a very warm, straightforward welcome to any gay or trans person who walked in off the street. And that might all be a bit confusing, but it that is part of the kind of confused reality we live in. What I find really alarming is when churches almost deliberately want to hide their position. And I think there's quite a bit of that goes on. The leadership might well take a very conservative position, but they don't want that broadcast because they recognise that probably an awful lot of people who worship in that community, that's not where they are and might be put off by it. And that, to my mind, lacks all integrity. So I really would want to encourage churches to engage with something like the SEM scheme where they can. But we're always going to have to recognise that there are shades of grey and complexities in all of that, because human beings in community are complicated.
Absolutely.
Probably, I'm certainly comfortable with term included because I think that's a kind of catch-all term that can be good, right. I think I prefer to say that we're affirming of diversity, like God. And I say that because I was teaching a course in America once, and there were 20 students in this kind of Master of Divinity course. And I said, I'd like you to go into 4 groups and just talk to each other about whether or not God favours diversity. And the only thing we can't talk about is sexuality. So they were away for about an hour and come back. And then just tumbling over each other. The books of the Bible, all different types of book, disciples who are male and female, poetry and this and that, all the tribes of Israel. And what they could see is that under God, diversity is a given. And to affirm diversity, I think, is to see it as something which is more than sexuality. It's also about affirming that people can have a difference of opinion. And for that reason, we don't talk
about. So we've spoken about a range of things, some of which are complicated, some of which are challenging, some of which are really quite positive and point towards some of what we can do. We've spoken about some things that are really quite interesting, and I wonder, to finish off, if you could share a little bit each about what brings you personally hope. What brings you hope? Maybe I'll answer first, actually, because I've asked you a difficult question. I'm going to give you a moment to ponder that. For me, it's conversations, real conversations with people that go beyond some of these dividing lines, where you can just have a chat and just be.
I think for me, I've been in my current role about 5 years, and to be an openly gay church leader, I suppose we're a bit reticent about the leadership language in the URC, but that's the kind of role I find myself in. And I confess I did wonder, is this going to be an issue? Is this going to be complicated at all? And I can honestly say that in 5 years in the role, it hasn't been an issue at all that I've been aware of. And some of the most supportive people to me in the role have been folks within the URC who would describe themselves as conservative evangelical, who would take a different view on human sexuality, but have been deeply supportive of me in the role, the kinds of things I've been trying to help the church to engage with. I think some have been quite surprised to find that a gay ministers can be quite into evangelism and think that might be really rather important in the life of the church. And I suppose it from that, in a sense, saying something very similar to what you've just said, it's when you forge those relationships across boundaries of difference and realise that you are all part of the multifaceted body of Christ and the people of God, that there is something profoundly hopeful in all of that.
I think I would say, what gives me hope is having seen that people can change. You know, I think some of my closest friends, when they first knew me, and I never hid to my friends that I was gay. I had to be very careful in the church. When I was before anybody else here in this room was born, probably, and it was at a time which it was a very unpopular thing to be gay. And so I have some of my closest friends are people who didn't suspect me, but suspected my sexuality, and now would want to affirm the people who are gay are okay and are their best friends. And I think we experience that, you know, that even people whose theology said we have to follow the Bible, and the Bible says, and you discover that this person, not through argument, but through friendship, has changed their mind. That gives me great hope.
I think following on from that, the fact that institutions can change and the church can change and has changed. You know, when I was growing up, the church was all white. It was those who were leading the church were all men. Nobody even said the word homosexuality. And now we've got in our church people of colour leading in all levels of leadership. We've got women leading, we've got people with disabilities much more able to take up roles and responsibilities and leadership within the church. And that's just in my lifetime. So I think, you know, institutions can change, however hard and slow it might feel, but the trajectory is going in the right direction.
Thank you all very much for this wonderful conversation, and particularly for those little seeds of hope to go away with. So thank you so much for being with us, and I hope you have a good rest of your days.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.